My daughter-in-law Renée looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You can't miss a hockey game, Douglas. This is my weekend and I need you here." I stood in my own kitchen, holding my brother's obituary in my hand, and I couldn't find a single word to say back. My brother Hugh died on a Tuesday. He was 61 years old, and he went the way our father went. Heart, no warning, no goodbye. The call came from my sister-in-law Carol at 6:30 in the morning, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time before I could get myself to stand up. Hugh and I had grown up in Sudbury, Ontario, 2 years apart. We'd shared a bedroom until I was 15. We'd driven to each other's weddings, painted each other's houses, watched each other's kids learn to walk. He was the person I called when I didn't know what to do, and now he was gone. The funeral was set for that Sunday in Sudbury, 4 hours north on the 400. I called my son Kevin that same morning to let him know, assuming, the way you always assume with your own children, that he would understand, that this was not a complicated thing, that a man attends his brother's funeral. Kevin didn't pick up. Renée did. She listened to me explain what happened, and there was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you more than whatever comes next. Then she said, "Oh, that's awful, Douglas. I'm so sorry about Hugh." And she sounded sorry, she really did. And then, 3 seconds later, "But this Sunday's a problem for us. Kevin and I have Liam's playoff game at 9, and then we're leaving right after for the cottage. You're supposed to have the boys." Liam was my grandson, 8 years old. He played minor hockey for the Barrie Colts House League. I loved that boy more than I knew how to say. I'd been to every home game that season, sat in a cold arena 3 Saturday mornings in a row with a Tim Hortons double-double going cold in my hand, cheering until my voice gave out. But this was his uncle's playoff game, not his grandfather's only chance to say goodbye to his brother. I said carefully, "Renée, this is Hugh's funeral." She said, "I know, and I feel terrible. But we've had this cottage booking since January. It's non-refundable, and Kevin really needs this break. You know how stressed he's been." I didn't say what I wanted to say. I asked her to have Kevin call me when he had a minute. Kevin called me back that afternoon. He said everything his wife had said, but in a different order. He mentioned Liam's game, the cottage, the non-refundable deposit. He mentioned how hard the past few months had been on them. He mentioned that I was retired and had more flexibility than they did. And then he said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound reasonable, "Dad, we can't just change all our plans?" Hugh would understand. I'm going to say that again because I need you to hear it. My son told me that my dead brother would understand if I missed his funeral to babysit his grandchildren, while he and his wife went to a cottage in Muskoka. I told Kevin I needed some time to think. I hung up, walked out to my back deck, and stood there looking out at my yard, the one I'd spent 30 years maintaining, the maple my late wife Sandra had planted this spring after we moved in, and I thought about what kind of man I wanted to be in this moment. Not the kind who makes a scene, not the kind who burns everything down. But also, I decided, not the kind who misses his brother's funeral because the booking was non-refundable. I called Kevin back an hour later and told him I would be driving to Sudbury on Sunday. I told him I loved him, and I loved the boys, and I was sorry for the inconvenience, but I was going to my brother's funeral. I told him if he needed to find alternate arrangements for the kids, I would help him make some calls. His mother's sister lived 20 minutes from them. Carol, from his hockey team, had offered to help out before. There were options. He said, "So you're really choosing a dead man over your living grandchildren?" I said, "I'm choosing to bury my brother Kevin." He hung up. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. It hurt the way only your own children can hurt you, right through the middle of you, in a place you didn't know was still soft. I sat with that for a while, made dinner. Couldn't eat it. Fed half of it to the neighbor's dog through the fence. Then I went to bed and told myself I would deal with whatever came next after I came home from Sudbury. What I didn't expect was what I found when I got home. The funeral was a Saturday wake and a Sunday service. I drove up Friday night, stayed at Carol's, and spent 2 days doing the slow, exhausting work of grief, shaking hands, accepting casseroles, saying the same things over and over to people I hadn't seen in years. Hugh's kids, my nephew Spencer and my niece Adrian, were grateful I came. Spencer pulled me aside at the reception and said, "Dad talked about you all the time, Uncle Doug. He would have wanted you here." That meant more to me than I can properly explain. I drove home Sunday night. Got in around 9. The house was dark, which was normal. I went to bed. Monday morning, my phone rang at 7:45. It was my bank, a woman from the fraud and disputes line. She said there had been some unusual activity on one of my accounts, and she needed to verify some transactions. I asked her what kind of transactions. She mentioned a large e-transfer, and then she mentioned the amount. $42,000. I said, "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" She did. I sat down at my kitchen table and asked her to tell me everything. What she told me took about 20 minutes, and it unraveled something I hadn't known was unraveling. Someone, and the name on the authorization was mine, though I had not authorized anything, had initiated a series of transfers from my RRSP savings account. The first one had gone through while I was in Sudbury. The bank had flagged it because it was unusually large and originated from a device they hadn't seen me use before. The transfer had not yet fully cleared. There was still a window, a small one, to dispute it. I told the woman to freeze everything she could freeze. She walked me through the steps. I was on the phone for the better part of 2 hours. When it was done, I sat at my kitchen table, with my coffee going cold in front of me, and I tried to think clearly about who had access to the information that would have been needed to initiate that transfer. My banking credentials, my social insurance number, the answers to my security questions. The list was short, uncomfortably short. I didn't want to believe it. I want to be very honest about that. I sat with every other possible explanation first. A random hack, a data breach, some criminal I'd never met who'd somehow assembled all my personal details from the internet. I sat with those explanations for about 3 days because they were easier to sit with. Then I talked to my neighbor Ted, who spent 30 years as a financial crimes investigator with the RCMP before he retired. Ted is not a warm man. He's blunt in the way that people who've spent decades looking at the worst of human behavior tend to become blunt. But he's honest. I told him what happened. He asked me a series of questions. He asked who had been in my home recently. He asked whether I kept any financial documents accessible in a filing cabinet or desk drawer. He asked whether I'd ever let anyone use my laptop. I'd let Kevin use my laptop in September. He'd said his had a cracked screen and he needed to print off some documents for work. He'd been in my home office for about 40 minutes. Ted looked at me over his coffee mug. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I went back to my office and, for the first time, I looked at what was actually on my desk. I keep a locked filing drawer, but I keep the key on a hook under the desk. I'd never hidden that from anyone. Why would I? It was my house. My family. You don't lock things up in your own house from your own children. The drawer had been opened. I knew because I keep a small piece of blue tape along the top edge of the drawer. An old habit from my working days when I used to file sensitive project documents, and the tape had broken. Recently, the files inside had been gone through. Not ransacked, not obviously disturbed, just gone through, carefully, by someone who knew enough to be careful. I sat there for a long time. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Janet, and she'd been practicing estate and fraud law in Barrie for over 20 years. I'd used her once before when Sandra passed to handle the estate, and I'd been grateful for her then. I went to her office on a Thursday morning and laid out everything I knew. The transfer, the laptop, the filing drawer, the timing. Janet listened without interrupting. Then she asked me some questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. She asked whether Kevin and Renée had any financial pressures I was aware of. I said I knew they'd been stretched. They'd bought a larger house in Innisfil 2 years ago, and the mortgage payments were significant. Kevin had mentioned once that their line of credit was maxed. She asked whether Renée had ever expressed any interest in my estate. I thought about that. There had been a conversation, maybe 18 months ago, at Christmas dinner. Renée had made a comment, offhand, I'd thought, about how helpful it would be if they knew what to expect, whether there would be anything to help them down the road. I'd changed the subject. I hadn't thought about it again until that moment. Janet asked me one more question. She asked whether I had ever signed any document in the past year that I hadn't fully read. And I thought about the previous spring. Kevin had come by with some papers. He'd said they were for something related to my benefits from my old pensional tension. That there was a form required to update the beneficiary information since Dandra had passed. I'd been distracted that day. I was doing yard work. He'd had a pen ready and the paper ready, and I'd signed without reading the full page. I told Janet this. She went quiet for a moment. She said, "Douglas, I'm going to need you to request a full copy of your account history, your pension records, and any changes made to authorize signatories on your accounts in the last 2 years." I did. It took about a week. What we found was not a simple e-transfer gone wrong. It was a pattern. Small changes made over many months. A secondary signatory added to one of my accounts. An address change on a financial document, redirecting correspondence to a P.O. box I'd never opened. A beneficiary change on a term life policy, one that removed my nephew Spencer's name and replaced it with Kevin's. I didn't sleep well during those weeks. I want to be honest about that too. This was my son who I had coached through his first job interview, who I had helped move 3 times, who I had held in a hospital waiting room the night Liam was born, both of us too nervous to talk, just sitting there together in the plastic chairs. I kept looking for the reason that would make all of this make sense in a different way. I kept hoping Janet was going to call me and say she'd made a mistake. She didn't call to say that. What she called to say about 3 weeks after our first meeting was that she had compiled enough documentation to take to the police and that she recommended I do so. I went to the Barrie Police Service on a Thursday morning in November. I brought Janet. I brought a folder that was about 2 inches thick. I sat across from a detective named Morrison, and I explained, as calmly as I could, what I believed had happened. Morrison asked questions, took notes, said he'd be in touch. I drove home and I sat in my driveway for a while before going inside. Kevin called me that same evening. I didn't pick up. He left a voicemail that was cheerful and ordinary. Something about Liam's hockey schedule, whether I wanted to come to the next game. I listened to it twice. Then I set my phone down. I didn't hear from Kevin directly for another 2 weeks. And then, on a Tuesday evening, my phone rang and it was Renée. She didn't say hello. She said, "Douglas, why is there a detective calling Kevin?" I said, "I think you both know why." She said, "This is insane. You think your own son stole from you? Do you hear yourself?" Her voice was the voice of someone who has rehearsed outrage, but hasn't quite landed the performance. I recognized it, though I couldn't have said why in that moment. I just knew it wasn't quite right. I said, "Renée, I have documentation. I've been working with a lawyer, and now with the police. I'm not going to discuss the details with you." She said, "If you do this, you will never see those boys again. Do you understand that? Liam and Connor, you will lose them." There it was. I had been waiting for it, I realized, not consciously, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I had known this was coming. The grandchildren as leverage. The thing that was supposed to stop me from doing what a reasonable person would do. I thought about Liam. I thought about Connor, who was 5 and still called me Gumpa because he couldn't quite get the word right when he was 2, and it stuck. I thought about sitting in that arena with the cold coffee. I thought about Hugh. I said, "Renée, I love those boys. I will always love them. But I am 63 years old, and I am not going to let someone steal the savings I spent my entire working life building and simply pretend it didn't happen. Not even for my grandchildren. I hope you and Kevin will think carefully about what comes next." She hung up. The investigation moved slowly, the way these things do. Morrison was thorough but not fast. Janet kept me updated on the civil side. There were steps being taken to reverse the account changes, to restore the beneficiary on the life policy, to document the full scope of what had been altered. I spent a lot of that winter at Janet's office, or on the phone with her, or sitting in my kitchen going through paperwork that made me feel tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. What kept me going, honestly, was Ted. He'd come over 2 or 3 times a week, drink my coffee, and not say much. Sometimes he'd bring his dog. On the days when I was most worn down, most tempted to call Kevin and tell him we could work something out, just to end all of it, Ted would say something like, "You didn't start this, just that." It was enough. Spencer called me in February. Hugh's son, my nephew. He'd heard through the family that something was going on, and he was calling to check on me. I told him what I could. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Uncle Doug, Dad always said you were the solid one. He said you were the one who didn't bend when things got hard." I didn't say anything for a moment because I didn't trust my voice. Then I thanked him and changed the subject. In March, Kevin was formally charged. 2 counts of fraud over $5,000, 1 count of unauthorized use of a financial document. Renée was not charged. Investigators concluded she had benefited from what Kevin did, but could not establish her direct participation. I don't know how I feel about that even now. What I know is that Kevin sat in a room with a lawyer and made a series of choices. I can't make those choices make sense. I've stopped trying. The court process is ongoing as I write this. Janet says these things take time. I've accepted that. What I didn't expect and what I want to tell you, because I think it matters, is what happened with the boys. Renée did cut off contact for a while. About 4 months. I won't pretend that wasn't painful, because it was. Those 4 months were some of the hardest of my life. I missed Connor's 5th birthday. I sent a card and a gift that I don't know if he ever received. But in July, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "This is Adrian, Kevin's wife's sister. I have Liam and Connor with me for the week. I think they'd really like to see their grandfather if you're willing." Renée asked me to reach out. Adrian. It turned out she and Renée had their own complicated history, and Adrian had her own views about what Kevin had done. She'd been helping with the boys while Renée dealt with everything. And she'd apparently told Renée, plainly, that keeping the boys from me was not fair to them. I drove to Adrian's place in Barrie on a Saturday morning. Connor ran to me before I was fully out of the car. He grabbed onto my legs and said, "Gumpa, where were you?" And I held on to that little boy for a long time and didn't say anything, because there was nothing I could say that would have been adequate. Liam was quieter. He's 8, and he understands more than he lets on. He sat with me on Adrian's front step and he said, "Is my dad in trouble?" I said, "There's some stuff happening with grown-up things, but it doesn't change that I love you." He thought about that for a minute. Then he said, "Are you going to come to my games again?" I said, "If you want me there, I'll be there." He nodded, and that was enough for him, at least for that day. I still don't know what the next year looks like. The legal process goes where it goes. Kevin and I haven't spoken since before the charges. I don't know if we ever will again, not in the way that used to feel natural. That's a loss I'm still learning to carry. But I drove to Sudbury and I said goodbye to my brother. I sat in that church and I listened to the organist play the same hymns we grew up with, and I looked at the photo of Hugh on the program, the one Carol chose, from a camping trip maybe 15 years ago, him grinning into the camera with a fish he'd just caught. And I knew I had done the right thing, not because it was easy, because it was true. Hugh would have done the same for me. He wouldn't have needed a single second to decide. And I think, in the end, that's what kept me going through all of it. The bank calls, the lawyers, the police, the silence from my son's house, the 4 months without my grandchildren. I kept asking myself, what would a man do here? A real one, the kind Hugh always believed I was. And every time I asked that, the answer was the same. You stand up, you tell the truth. You don't let someone take what isn't theirs, not your savings, not your dignity, not your right to bury your brother. You stand up, and you keep standing.